To our second panel this afternoon, and I'm really pleased that we have an opportunity to just sort of recap a little bit of where we think we are. I think in the last session we started talking a little bit about some of the challenges and opportunities that we see in looking at coastal resilience, both internationally, and wanted to begin to think about this a little bit domestically also. So part of why I find this particularly exciting and important right now is because we're able to have this conversation on coastal resilience in collaboration with our partners. So as Jane has mentioned, we've been working with the Resilience Academy, and most recently we built on that to have a collaboration with the Hoover Institution and the Woods Institute at Stanford University. So our colleagues from the Hoover Institution and Stanford Woods Institute are joining me to talk a little bit about where we are. And we started this conversation because we wanted to think about what's happening with regards to coastal resilience. What do we know in terms of the evidence and the scientific base? What are the different methodological approaches to address these issues? What kinds of questions are being asked? What are we learning? And really, what does that mean in the context of building resilience? We've had lots of conversations about how we define resilience. You know, we've been looking at resilience in terms of transformation. We have talked about how this links to sustainable development, how that is different from sustainability. What does it mean as we look at questions around vulnerabilities? And what are some of the innovations that we need to be thinking about? So we have launched this partnership to begin to understand these set of issues and to begin to think about different ways that we can move forward to increase our understanding. So we had an initial conversation around this, focusing a little bit on infrastructure and what do we know in terms of looking at questions around infrastructure development and infrastructure resilience in a coastal context. We then build on those conversations to begin to look at issues around sea level rise and what are we learning, what are some of the approaches, what are some of the challenges, and then tie that into questions about ocean health. And these were very productive, engaging, challenging questions for us to begin to explore, and then we wanted to bring in the international dimension, which we've been doing this week. So if that's okay, Alice, I'd like to start with you again, but to ask you to just reflect a little bit on the conversations that we have been having. I know you've been helping us think about some of the conversations on the infrastructure side. What are your thoughts? What were some of the things that emerged from our conversations that you think we really need to just take a step back and say, okay, here are some of the key things that we have been discussing that we want to reframe and share and get your thoughts and reactions to?
When we started this, we had a meeting here in Washington, and we carved out 5 topics that we thought would be particularly salient for a coastal resilience initiative. And the 5 topics were coastal risk management, physical and social infrastructure, relocation, governance, and security. As we've gone through these various events, there are a couple of those issues that have had recurring resonance for me, and the first will be governance. And that reflects the challenge that we have that human society developed somewhat organically. We created lots of jurisdictions, towns, states, counties, and overlapping systems, judicial systems, emergency management, and the maps don't all align to begin with. So you're going to have different regions for different kinds of activities, even though they're primarily government-driven. And so how do we get those communities to plan for risks that come in and do not respect jurisdictional boundaries at all, including our national boundaries. So you have major water sources, shared water sources. You have threats to coastal communities, and if you build harden in one area with a seawall, you could have a negative effect with the community next door. This was probably most vividly illustrated for me at our event in California when we looked very closely at what was happening in San Francisco for the San Francisco Bay, planning for sea level rise. And of course, California has been a leader in the United States in addressing climate impacts. We had 5 representatives from various agencies that were looking at sea level rise in the San Francisco Bay. We had the head of a utilities organization, the Army Corps of Engineers, someone from a baseball team, the San Francisco Giants, who have a beautiful stadium right on the coast, and someone who is managing the watershed. Great efforts, all described individually what they're doing, and then shared that there were 100 other communities essentially that were affected by the same risk of sea level rise. And what was revealed is they were each planning to their own scenario. So one was planning for 3 feet of sea level rise, another was planning for 5 feet, and Army Corps of Engineers was planning for 9 feet. So the question then becomes, how do we make sure that those plans knit together in a coherent way that really protects the community long term, even though their jurisdictional boundaries really incentivize them to plan on an individual basis rather than plan collectively. There have been a few examples that have emerged along the way, but certainly that's one takeaway for me, that we need to help find governance models that communities can see themselves working in that way to come to a better planning going forward to make sure that we're not inadvertently making mistakes. Another theme that has been throughout all of these, but was first surfaced for me in our meeting here in DC, is vulnerable communities. And this was particularly, we had a representative from FEMA, former FEMA, Marcy Roth, who has done work in coastal communities looking at what we have in the United States right now. Is we have a lot of elevation occurring. So we have maybe a house that's raised 15 feet above the house next door. That's not an uncommon sight in coastal communities now. The person with who invests in raising their house anticipates that they're going to be able to withstand a storm surge or whatever. Her work revealed, and I had not really thought about that, how that approach to planning for coastal resilience tears away at the fabric of the community. Because if you don't have an elevator to those homes, that means there's just not access for those who are in a wheelchair. And that if we don't begin to incorporate consideration of how do we enhance the social fabric, we put ourselves at risk for greater tragedy. We all know that if we know our neighbors, we're much more likely to survive in a disaster than if we don't. And if we are constructing communities in ways to prevent damage from sea level rise that cuts at that fabric, it may ultimately make us even more vulnerable. And I simply hadn't thought about that. And we are learning that with Houston, with the nursing homes, that we need to really make sure that we are mindful of the needs of the elderly and those who are more challenged. My final takeaway has been, and this has been consistent, is build in flexibility, that none of us are really 100% sure how any of this will unfold, and that the best thing is to be mindful, but make sure that we are flexible in our plans. And certainly the Army Corps of Engineers planning for 9 feet made clear, I'm not building to 9 feet right now, but my plans will accommodate 9 feet if we decide that's truly the risk. And that seems to be a very wise way to go. So those were my major takeaways from our start to, and then I saw them recurring through our events.
So I really, thank you, Alice. I really like all these points, but I particularly want to talk a little bit more about this question of governance models that you raise. And I know we've spoken about this a little bit, but and it, you know, part of what I was surprised at in our conversations with our international partners is to also see how this question of governance models is playing out at the international level in different socioeconomic, cultural, poor resource settings also. And I kept hearing in our conversations this week and today about questions and action being community-led. And I kept thinking, well, what's the role of the federal government, of the government overall? So as you raise this question on governance models and this push and desire for community-led initiatives, talk a little bit about that space, this sort of top-down, bottom-up, operating at different scales. What's the role of the federal government versus local entities, mayors, cities? Talk a little bit about that.
So when we look at the role of the federal government, from my perspective, in this area, the federal government should be in a supporting role. It has the capacity to produce fantastic science. It has the capacity to innovate or do the research on issues that maybe a community couldn't take on themselves. It can gather the best lessons of best practices, from example that we heard here this afternoon, and share those more widely. Those efforts are still ongoing in the Trump administration, and that is a very important role, I believe, for the federal government. The federal government can also incentivize communities to work together. We saw that with the HUD competition, the Rebuild by Design. One of the factors in rewarding from out of that billion-dollar competition, one of the factors was if you were planning with another community. And that seems to me to be something that the federal government can signal. We understand you are putting yourselves at risk if you haven't considered who's downstream from you or upstream from you as you make whatever plans you have. And encourage through whatever means, if it's lots of different ways that the government can incentivize behavior, but encourage planning from governance. I think it can also share best practices that it's seeing throughout the nation. That's one of the privileges of working in the federal government. You have the opportunity to really see across the nation in a way that it may be difficult for a small group of planners in one community to have access to. So those are important roles, but these are all local decisions, and they'll have to be made on a local and regional basis. I don't think it will go well if the federal government arrives and says, we're here to help, and then starts making those kinds of decisions for the community.
Great, thank you. So Catherine, you're a senior research scientist at Stanford, also an adjunct assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon, visiting investigator at the Carnegie Institution for Science, and you're leading the work at Stanford's Environmental Assessment Facility. And I really like in your bio, you talk about advancing foundations for action. You know, you're really focused on what we know about science and how we move to action. So with that framing, talk a little bit about some of your reflections from the conversations we've been having.
Great, and it's fun that you brought in my own personal angle, which would be, I think we're all aware that there's a major gap between knowledge and its effective use in decision-making, and that would certainly be the case in all of these resilience dialogues as well. It's been an amazing series of conversations that we've had over the last months, and I'm going to dive in, as Roger Mark said, to one specific component of what we talked about a month ago on the Stanford campus. And those were the discussions of sea level rise and ocean health, and in particular, what we know on the science, how we see adaptation unfolding in the world, and where there are opportunities for what we do next. There were 4 themes that cut across the conversations for sea level rise and ocean health. The first one is that in both of these realms, in terms of what we know, there are incredibly important knowns at the same time that there are incredibly important unknowns. And so what that means is if we think about resilience towards sea level rise or ocean health into the future, it's about risk, managing it smartly, where maybe the most important thing to start with is that the nature of risk is fundamentally different if we continue into the future with continued high emissions of heat-trapping gases as compared to a world of ambitious mitigation. So for sea level rise, the knowns are things like temperature. When water warms up, it takes up more space. The important unknowns are the rate of collapse of the great ice sheets on planet Earth, and in particular, part of the Antarctic called the West Antarctic Ice Sheet. Really one of the biggest questions in terms of understanding whether there will be 9 feet of sea level rise in the US by the end of this century, or something like 2 or 3. For the oceans, some of the knowns and unknowns are also things that Alice discussed in the last session, whether it's the Arctic and the incredibly rapid rates of physical change that we see in terms of air temperature, melting permafrost, melting sea ice, the way that is shaping ecosystem outcomes for indigenous peoples dependent on them, at the same time that is opening up commercial opportunities that raise all sorts of questions, again, about governance. Some of the unknowns in the ocean space are about the fact that the ocean is simultaneously growing, as some scientists like to say when they're more accessible, hot, sour, and breathless simultaneously.
Never heard that.
Hot, it's warming up. Sour, it's acidifying. And breathless, it's losing oxygen. And some of the big open questions are, well, what happens when all 3 happen simultaneously? Really easy to put your coral reef in a test tube and heat it up. Harder to get at the interactions between those 3 types of drivers. A second theme that emerged in sea level rise and ocean health is that thresholds and nonlinearities are really important. Some of those are, yes, about ice sheet collapse. Exactly when will we trigger irreversibilities that future generations for centuries and millennia might need to grapple with? But it's also about things that we're already experiencing. The fact that as the seas rise, you get very different thresholds that come into play for flooding risk. Once subways flood, you have very large damages that don't happen if you have not exceeded that threshold. At the same time that 2 feet of sea level rise causes a lot more damages than 1 feet, more than twice as much. There's also the nonlinearities of what happens when you get a cyclone striking on top of sea level rise. That's a profound disruption in the system that is not a gradual effect. A final nonlinearity would be that in terms of ocean health, there are flips that can happen as a coral reef bleaches out, for example, or in the Arctic when you think about some of the kelp forests interacting with ice sheet ice systems more broadly. A third theme was what's the state of adaptation in this space? The fact that there are so many adaptations already happening, albeit more in the realm of planning, more in the realm of win-win things that we should do no matter what, and how we're just starting to think about the long term and how that will involve things like partnerships that we heard about earlier really compellingly, that will also require seeing risk and being bold in a way that we have not yet done. Final theme, in terms of how science can be actionable and relevant in this space of sea level rise and ocean health, there's a huge amount of discussion about the fact that it requires dialogue that is interactive and sustained. Oftentimes, you might have the question that seems most relevant to a policy decision, but that question scientifically might be unanswerable on a century time frame, which means that you want to have those interactive conversations about what are the questions, what questions are answerable, and how does that shape the nature of goals and pathways moving forward. And the final part of that dialogue was that it's really important for communication to be accessible, to talk about hope, not fear, solutions, not problems, and to have uncommon messengers there in the mix. And I'll just end with one thing that we learned from the Monterey Bay Aquarium, which is very, very effective in the communication space, which is that the sea otter is their secret weapon in terms of communicating with the public.
We need a sea otter, huh?
Yeah. So in kicking off this week with us, Alice's talk was entitled Resilience in the Face of Uncertainty. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, because you talk about the knowns and unknowns. You talk about thresholds and non-linearities. You talk about the flips that can happen. How do we move forward accepting that there's always going to be a degree of uncertainty. We're not going to be able to answer all of the questions. What's your sense of how we can move forward, given that we have to accept that?
So I think one really important thing is that the future is always uncertain. For that Carnegie Mellon affiliation that I have, there's this amazing scholar named Granger Morgan, who's a real expert in the space of how do we make decisions under uncertainty, and he likes to provide a reminder that basically every choice we make in life, whether we're taking out a mortgage or we're getting married or we're starting a new job, there's an uncertainty about what the future will hold. So the good thing is that because the future is always uncertain, there are tons of tools that can be applied in the climate space that haven't necessarily been applied so far. I think the example of Munich Reinsurance, really knowing how to deal with risk, and the climate community having a lot to learn from those types of approaches, or the security realm, where there's always an inherent unpredictability about complex interactions on the international stage. That's the same for climate, even though we have not to date really applied scenario thinking in a way that grapples with that type of uncertainty. So uncertainty can be paralyzing, but I think really the important thing is to recognize that managing risk in the climate challenge is not really different from managing risk in any other aspect of what we do.
It's interesting. I'm going to be using that with my young teenage sons also. So Chris Field is the Perry L. MacArthur Director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. And Chris, you know, you have such an impressive record of working domestically and internationally. So I'm really looking forward to hearing some of your thoughts on the discussions that you've been involved in as part of this collaboration.
Well, thank you, Roger Mark, so much, and thanks to everyone here. This series of conversations that we've been engaged in with the really effective Hoover, Wilson, Stanford partnership has been really rewarding. It's opened up a whole bunch of different windows on the climate resilience issue that were really new to me, and I want to highlight just a few of the realizations I've made. But I actually want to start by stepping back a little bit into more my climate change management experience and talk just for a couple of minutes about climate change mitigation, decreasing the amount of climate change that occurs, because I think there's an unresolved tension between how much we should be investing in mitigation, decreasing the amount of climate change that occurs, and in building resilience. And I think the answer is relatively clear. Catherine already spoke to the risk of really major thresholds, and there are a number of thresholds that we have increasing evidence have dramatically increasing risks with just a modest amount of warming past where we are now. And in particular, we face a risk of going from large but modest amounts of sea level rise, less than a meter, to several meters with the collapse of a major fraction of the Antarctic ice sheet. Maybe not in this century, but in the longer term. We face a real risk of converting large parts of the high latitude landmass in the northern hemisphere from sort of carbon neutral to a massive carbon source as organic matter that's frozen in permafrost soils begins to decompose. And we face the challenge that ecosystem human impacts may interact in ways that become really, really difficult to control. And a lot of the motivation for the really ambitious temperature goal in the Paris Agreement is that the risk of one of these threshold effects gets to be really large as we approach and then exceed 2C. And especially for the issue of sustaining resilience in coastal communities, there's a vast difference between the prospects for long-term success with a sea level rise of 0.5 meter, which is still within the range of possibilities, even over several centuries, if we can stabilize at 2C or better, versus a long-term commitment to more than 3 meters of sea level rise, which is what happens if we trigger the instability in the West Antarctic ice sheet. And that brings up an additional element that I think should be part of our conversation, and we really struggle with in discussions about climate change. There's this very long time horizon that tends to disappear in conversations about economies, and it tends to disappear in conversations about politics. But when you talk about existential issues with whether nations are going to continue to exist, there are many nations for which a sea level commitment of 3 to 5 meters or more really is totally existential. And from that perspective, it doesn't really matter whether we're confronting a massive amount of sea level rise in 2100 or several centuries later. And realistically, the prospect of several meters of sea level rise is well in the future. But because it's existential, it doesn't really matter. The challenge is somehow we need to be able to integrate this thinking about truly existential threshold risks into the way we think about the climate challenge. In addition, when we think about the relative emphasis on mitigation and building resilience, we need to keep in mind that most of the damages from a changing climate come in extreme events. So we tend not to, lose farms or businesses or our homes as a result of average conditions. We lose them in the extremes, and very much of the dynamic of a changing climate is changing the frequency and intensity of extremes, especially for the most consequential extremes, the really rare big ones. It's really hard to learn from those because they are really rare and really big. And so at the end, I want to loop back to the concept of building a better approach to education about climate risks, because I think unless we can figure out how to integrate an understanding of the role of climate extremes, it's going to be really hard to be as effective as we need to be in dealing with building resilience. On the other hand, we've seen some incredibly positive things. I think from both the mitigation perspective and the building resilience perspective, the most compelling message that I take away from the series of conversations we've had is that climate is a challenge, is a problem we can solve. We're not solving it now, and we need to do a lot of things differently than we're doing, but the core technologies, the core elements of social fabric, the core understanding that are necessary to solve the problem are mostly in place. And I think a real key to moving forward with solutions is to capitalize on where there are co-benefits. And a co-benefit means investment in an aspect of mitigation or an aspect of adaptation that also contributes to building strong communities, to economic opportunities, or to assuring that societies can be successful and ecosystems can be robust. The way I think about it is that the historical framing of the challenge we face is that there was a mitigation, adaptation, development trade-off, and that investments in any one pool couldn't go into the others. And I think the discovery in the last few years is that it's not always a trade-off, and the best investments in addressing climate can really provide co-benefits that extend from adaptation to mitigation to development. And a lot of the challenge that we face is figuring out where those opportunities are and how to take advantage of them. And I guess that brings me to the specific comments I want to make about what I learned from our discussions about the San Francisco Bay event. And Alice already spoke to one really important conclusion, which is that even if everybody's on the same side and everybody wants to solve the same problem, they have to understand they have the same problem in order to come up with consistent solutions. But I actually took away from the diversity of ideas and the diversity of standards, thresholds that different entities were designing to a really important starting point for a conversation. And I think that, at least for me, the message I take away from the whole process is that there is enough shared experience and enough shared sense of ultimate goals that we can use that as a starting point. So let me just say there were four things that came up as big challenges for our understanding of what we could do with San Francisco Bay, and interestingly enough, I heard those reiterated in our conversations about the Marianas and the Marshall Islands and Fiji. So first of all, there's a first mover problem that anybody who decides to be ambitious in dealing with climate change tends to take on extra risk and extra expenses, especially if the problem's slow to unfold. There's a tremendous need for finding ways to share risk, but there's a tremendous temptation to convert that into a way to subsidize the risk, to try to get somebody else to take responsibility for the risk. And when we talk about the scale at which solutions get involved with community scale investments and government or regional and international scale investments, we need to think a lot about how widely we want to share the risks and when it's appropriate for risk to be subsidized. And the loss and damage discussion that Salim led this morning, I think, really highlights the fact that if we want a solution that really resonates, that it's going to have some components of risk subsidization as well as of straight risk sharing. In terms of solutions for San Francisco Bay and other regions, the two things that I heard most frequently were there's tremendous opportunity for adjustable infrastructure and adjustable social institutions, and it doesn't necessarily mean that if one San Francisco Bay stakeholder is building to 3 feet and another is building to 9 feet, that those can't both get you to the same place in, say, 2150. You just need to be smart about the infrastructure and about the issues with the urban design. It's also clear that when we look at any of these issues, there's a big place for local communities, for government, for NGO, for the private sector, and for ecosystems, and we need to think really creatively about how we want to capitalize on our understanding of the way ecosystems work to have a good combination of green infrastructure and gray infrastructure, and making sure that to the extent possible we're not locking ourselves into maladaptations as a result of taking too short-term an approach. Okay, I want to close with 3 thoughts about what I learned about empowering good decisions in the future. And at least for me, the most consistent message I heard across all of the discussions in our entire Uncommon Dialogue series was that building resilience is really a challenge of winning hearts and minds more than it is of pouring concrete and raising structures. That there has to be a shared understanding of our common mission and the reason that we need to be working on things together. There's a tremendous challenge in having an education infrastructure that helps people understand the nature of risk and helps people understand the opportunities that come from good solutions. And then I think the final thing I learned is that there's a tremendous role for strong communities, and there's an opportunity to use dealing with building resilience to help strengthen communities, but there also is an early mover problem in the sense that without the strong communities, it's hard to get going. And when we think about bringing solutions to scale and having actors at different stages, the sense of shared mission is really critical. Unfortunately, I think that in the global stage today, it's something we have way too little of. And when we think about the philosophical and ethical and psychological components of addressing the problem, what we really need to do is figure out how to win the battle of hearts and minds. At the same time, we win the battle of the technology and the finance and the infrastructure.
Wow, you laid out a lot for us. That was great. Thank you. So, Chris, as you talk about this challenge of winning the battle of hearts and minds, I know that some of us who have been looking at climate challenges and opportunities, have been working to make the connection in a way that would resonate with a wider audience. And one of the ways that we have thought about doing this is to connect this to security issues, which came up in our discussions. And as you know, we have worked with others who have talked about climate as a threat multiplier. As we try to frame some of the ways that we could present this in a way that others will take it up and be receptive and want to engage. And there are others who criticize us for doing that. They say that, you're securitizing the issue. What are your thoughts as we think about finding different ways to win these hearts and minds, and the links that may be made to security? And I would just, even following up on the earlier panel, one of our colleagues from Australia said to me earlier today, those of us in Australia were seeing everyone making almost a facile connection between climate displacement, migration, and security. And many of us in Australia were saying, whoa, climate displacement is not a security issue for us in Australia. So there are different spin-offs and dimensions to this. What are your thoughts?
It's a really great question, and it's, of course, a really hard question. Catherine's leading a project now on climate change and conflict, and she can speak to where the evidence base is on some of these relationships, where, I would say that from a abstract perspective, the big risks we face from a climate change are likely to be the indirect ones. It's where we have interactions between climate and other societal conditions, where an existing societal weakness is amplified by some kind of climate change effect, which leads to some kind of a knock-on effect. And it's essentially impossible to prove those kinds of relationships. And to some extent, we have to recognize that the kind of information that we're going to have available when we decide how much effort to invest in climate is not going to be a detailed understanding of these complicated multi-sector interactions, these multi-stressor amplified effects. On the other hand, I would argue that there's a lot of evidence available to indicate that those are the kinds of challenges the world faces today, and that a resilient society that's meeting the needs and aspirations of communities everywhere is much better prepared to deal with those than one that isn't. And so I guess one possible framing is that's what security means, and that investing in robust communities is a good way to minimize the risk that security challenges do come up. But I think there are also much clearer direct implications that can be a part of the conversation. We could talk about some of those, but I guess the thought I'd like to leave people with is that I don't think there's a single entry point that's going to work for most people. And for folks who are living on a low-lying island in the Pacific, the issues are going to be very different than they are for people who live in the wildland-urban interface in the West, or for people who are experiencing nuisance flooding in Virginia. And I think that in every case, what we really need to do is help people understand that these climate risks are just part of the big environment that we all live in, and we're trying to manage to the best of our ability to have a sustainable future. And that climate change, we don't want to deal with climate change as an isolated one-off issue. We want to deal with it at the same time we're dealing with everything else, which is what the political institutions seem to be worst at. And that's the essence of the problem.
Do you want to add anything on that question?
I could. If
Yes,
that's okay.
please.
Yeah. Okay, so we're doing this project on climate change and conflict now at Stanford, but in some ways it comes out of the last report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for which Chris is co-chair and I directed science. And that report, for the first time ever, had a human security chapter, and it was an amazing chapter. If you like dense 20-page documents, I would highly recommend it. And it took a really broad framing to the security issue. It basically said human security is about protecting the vital core of human lives, and that has many different shapes or forms. And it basically hit 5 different categories of impacts and responses interacting in a changing climate that are relevant in that space. Number 1, culture. As impacts unfold and people are affected, it's not just the concrete, tangible impacts, but it's the way our interactions with each other that go back in time are affected that is important to consider. Number 2, migration. And what the chapter hit there most of all is the fact that migration can be very strategically adaptive in ways that are good for sending and receiving populations at the same time that it can be disruptive. And encompassing that type of complexity is something we're just really beginning to grapple with. In the conflict space, there is a war in the literature on climate change and conflict, and that's why we're doing the project in this space. I think the bottom line would be that conflict is inherently unpredictable. So teasing out the specific mechanistic role of climate is really, really hard because it's very hard to tease out the specific mechanisms that hold in any conflict that you're looking at the same time that they're important dimensions of risk. And we're really in action with this project, but if I were to predict the outcome, I think there will be a lot more agreement about what would happen with conflict in a 2 degrees Celsius world, a 4 degrees Celsius world, as compared to understanding the role of weather and conflict to date. Category number 4 of impacts was what happens when you lose nations or territorial integrity is affected or the shared resources, whether it's in the Arctic or watersheds, are affected. And the final one would be, as we think about achieving a global transformation, as Chris described, to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius, those are global transformations of our energy and land systems. And if you pop open the hood on some of the technical results that, for example, underpin Article 4 in the Paris Agreement, peaking emissions as soon as possible and getting them to 0 in the second half of the 21st century. That could involve, for example, in some of these technical results, converting 10% of the land surface to bioenergy. Now, I'm not going to bet on that as a likely outcome, but those sorts of extreme outcomes that we're trying to achieve in transformation have some risks that are relevant to security as well.
It's really fascinating. I mean, we have a program that we direct here with USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation. We are specifically looking at these questions, and we try to complement the sort of these 5 dimensions that you talk about from a foreign assistance perspective. And if you're going to look at the degree to which climate change is having an impact on outbreaks of conflict, what type of conflict, and what are the type of interventions that could be supported. You know, in some cases, we saw that it's better to work with communities and leverage social capital. And in other communities, it's better to work on institutional building at that level to help develop norms and ways to deal with conflict. So it's just to say in the foreign policy space and foreign assistance space, there's a lot of work going on to try and complement that. So it's great to hear of this. Alice, anything that you wanted to add on the security dimension?
I think that we've heard the very broad definition of human security versus what you see in the halls of government, a more narrow view of national security, which usually involves the Department of Defense. Understanding climate, that it will affect food, water, energy, that is still a work in progress for our more traditional national security apparatus. We've had every Secretary of State has, even our current Secretary of State, Secretary Mattis, has called out climate change as a threat to our national security. Getting under the hood of that and making sure that we are getting the best science, informing our intelligence analysis, and then informing our strategies and policies is still a work in progress. President Obama issued an executive order requiring exactly that across the federal government from its security, science, and intelligence agencies. President Trump has decided to rescind that executive order. So there is an open question as to how that message is received within the intelligence and the Department of Defense, as well as the Department of Homeland Security, are more traditional security agencies. So we are still at that dichotomy of human security and national security, and we haven't fully incorporated considerations of, for example, the risk of conflict in our strategies for our national security yet.
Great. Thank you. So we want to take it out to you now. We really want to have a conversation with you. We'd welcome your thoughts, reactions, questions. I'll ask you again to give your name and affiliation quickly. And we would start, Gretchen, up front here with Salim. Anyone else has thoughts or questions? Salim.
Thank you very much, everybody, for a very rich discussion. I'm Sylhet Haq. I'm director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development at the Independent University, Bangladesh. I'd like to just share some thoughts where we might want to think about seeing the climate change problem with maybe a little bit of a silver lining in it. And I would suggest that President Trump's attitude towards the climate agreement, the Paris Agreement in particular, may offer us an opportunity because it has unleashed in the United States of America, I can see, a lot of interest in the Paris Agreement and what it means. And I think one of the interesting elements of the Paris Agreement is that once the agreement is there in place and President Obama signed up the United States to it, you, me, we are all now implementers of the Paris Agreement. We don't need Mr. Trump's permission to implement it. And I work on Article 11 of the Paris Agreement, which is on capacity building. We can work together on this. Nothing prevents us from doing this. So I would like to offer a new paradigm of thinking in which we bring together people who are interested in solving the problem or tackling the problem under the rubric of solidarity. We demonstrate solidarity with each other. And I'll mention how I do this in very retail sense. I bring students from the United States of America to Bangladesh. They come and spend time in Bangladesh, help us solve our problems, but also learn for Bangladesh, for the United States. I have an architecture master's, PhD student at MIT looking at Louisiana and Bangladesh in terms of levee systems and comparing and learning from each other. I have somebody at Syracuse University looking at a community-based vulnerable community in Miami versus a vulnerable community in Dhaka and seeing if they can learn from each other. And I think this, on the coastal resilience side, there is an opportunity for this kind of solidarity building between communities, not just next door to each other, upstream, downstream, as Alice mentioned, but across borders, across the world. You know, we have commonalities of interest here that we can build on, and we've given, you know, IT technology and the ability of social media to connect people. We can actually connect with each other across the globe much more effectively now with this sense of solidarity, tackling a common global problem all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please. Gentleman at the back there. Yes.
I thank you for a very interesting discussion. My name is Dan Borges. I am currently a writer, formerly with the Army Corps of Engineers. I was the Chief of Business Practices. I was the Senior Policy Advisor for Water Resources at the Nature Conservancy for a number of years. Spent too much time on Capitol Hill trying to influence legislation. So what I'm doing now is writing fiction to try and engage the emotions and the heart of folks rather than necessarily the academic and scientific things that we're all used to. My question is there an opportunity for collaboration across academic communities, the humanities, to engage more people nationally into this debate beyond the smaller circle of folks who like to come to the Wilson Center perhaps to talk about this?
Thank you. I mean, beyond the wide range of people coming to the Wilson Center. I think there was another hand. Is there another hand? Yes, we go to you, and then Kisa, I'll come to you shortly.
Hi, I'm Aly Mitchell. I'm a Knaus Fellow through NOAA. And I apologize, I wasn't here this morning, so if you've already talked about this, my bad. But we've heard a lot about frameworks and how to talk about climate change, how to win hearts and minds, and a little bit about governmental process. But I'm wondering if you can comment on how you can imagine us utilizing appropriate levers in industry and economies to be able to especially work on resilient coastal infrastructure. And I work a lot in the maritime industry and shipping and thinking about the interactions between ports and economic drivers and the environment. So I'm just hoping to hear whether you think that's an appropriate way to think about coastal resiliency, and if it is appropriate, how to tie in the higher 30,000 academic work about climate change and resiliency into how you get boots on the ground to build the infrastructure.
Great, thank you. So let's tackle those three, and we'll come back. How can we continue to build solidarity? We're all in this together. What are opportunities to work across disciplines? And what are some of the levers looking at economics and industry to build resilient coastal infrastructure? Alice?
Well, I'll start with the arts and humanities question, because my husband is a arts and humanities guy. There's a wonderful new, you're part of it, cli-fi. I didn't know that term, but a whole genre of fiction depicting what could happen. Very powerful. I think that's a wonderful way to help all of us visualize what this will mean for us. Certainly the universities, you'll see, I have a friend at Cornell who works on this, so you're seeing more of this develop. I think there's a role for the universities that is, I'll tell you just a little snippet. It's not necessarily the arts and humanities, but it should be the whole university, I think, engaged on what does it mean to be a resilient university within our community. And I'll share this, that I went and spoke to Harvard recently, and I thought, oh, I'll look up their resilience plan. I looked up their resilience plan. It said they had a great plan. They're going to finish it in 2016, and it will solve everybody's problems and look at their issues with Boston. So I asked the person who invited me, could I get a copy of that plan? That's really exciting that they're doing this. Plan doesn't exist. And this is what I see in universities, so I think there is a role for academia to step up here and say, we will be resilient ourselves to help lead the community, and that would include looking at how the arts and humanities can contribute to helping communities figure out these problems. Just on the issue of the levers, let me just say, ports is huge. If you can find an issue on ports to build with a project, there is no single greater threat in terms of shipping, supply chains, or commerce, economic impact, food security for the Djibouti to get food to Ethiopia. Not enough work here. Our navies, our coastal or Coast Guard look and are working hard on it, but I don't think there's enough private sector work on this. When I went to Houston in 2014, it was identified the risk to the Houston shipping channel that we still have not been able to resolve. So don't have a sound plan yet. I think you just pick an area and you could make progress in there, in that area incrementally.
Great. A lot of really interesting points there, so I'll try to be brief. To Salim's first point, I think just focusing on the U.S., distributed leadership in the climate challenge is absolutely essential. The top-down, bottom-up reverberations are key, and if all of us have a bit of angst in terms of climate policy at the moment, I think the hope comes from the fact that we're seeing radical ambition at the state level and the private sector. I was at BU yesterday, down the street from Harvard, and they're pushing forward with a BU Bold initiative, trying to say, can they get to zero emissions by 2040? Once we start to see some case studies of success where there's complete decarbonization and an endgame energy that looks different, it will be a lot easier more broadly. In terms of getting academics to collaborate, we should talk. That is my biggest passion. In terms of making knowledge actionable and influential, it's all about interactively evaluating what we know overall and interactively communicating it. And in terms of knowledge that is relevant, it's really the full panoramas of understanding that cuts across every discipline, not just natural and social sciences, but humanities, including moral philosophers, for example. Really fun to put a moral philosopher together with a physicist and get them to really think about the deep implications of science. And it involves understandings that go far beyond academia. I think the reason why we've been doing these uncommon dialogues is that academics have no idea what the biggest, most pressing questions are unless they're in communication in a really interactive, in-depth way. And then just the last theme in terms of levers in coastal areas, I think it comes down to supply chains, it comes down to patterns of development, and there's some really neat examples spanning from long-term planning happening in Louisiana to the way that, for example, RAND's been doing robust decision-making where they'll take a port, they'll say, we don't know exactly how much sea level rise will happen, but we'll run thousands of scenarios and then start to think backwards through that space of uncertainties of where do goals fail and how does that mean we can piece together adaptation trajectories into the future.
I might just say a couple things about the way I think about the Paris Agreement. I think the gigantic breakthroughs of the Paris Agreement were really twofold. It established a global foundation, an agreement on what's a fair way to think about the issue. And even though the amount of emissions reductions weren't sufficient, the sense of fairness is really overwhelmingly important. And it also established a pathway so that with increasing ambition it could be banned. And I think those two things are both really suffered a frontal attack with the U.S. withdrawal. And the resurgence of interest in the We Are Still In movement and other movements around this country and others really demonstrate the commitment of people, but a really fundamental important feature of the climate challenges is the relevance of near-term action, and with every year we're just so much closer to that cumulative emissions that are associated with 2C that we really can't afford to wait. And I think I hope the narrative of using U.S. withdrawal as a way to help build solidarity around other kinds of stakeholders it is going to be effective. The basic problem is that many aspects of dealing with climate change can be handled at the local or the corporate or the NGO scale, but many can't, and we do need to figure out a way for the world to be able to move such that it's not too disoriented as a consequence of the U.S. actions. I love going from the U.S. Army Corps to writing fiction about climate. I could think of some other ways that might be characterized, but I love the concept, and I think that we really don't know. What we know is that an information deficit, if I just explain more loudly or more often that you'll get it, isn't the right way to address this problem. And I wish you and everybody who's looking at different approaches to the climate communications and winning the challenge of the hearts and minds success. With ports, the cover of our IPCC report on regional solutions was the Port of Rotterdam, and I think you confirmed the relevance of that decision about the photo.
Great, thank you. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Kees van der Geest at United Nations University and University of Hawaii. I have a question for Christopher and Catherine about their role also in the IPCC. So the Resilience Academy that we organized here at the Wilson Center this week was much about making our research meaningful to policy. Now, we talked a bit about direct avenues of doing so. We went to the Capitol Hill. We got really interesting inside information on how we could influence policy, and they were also quite realistic that maybe that's quite difficult right now. So another avenue of influencing policy with our research is through the IPCC indirectly. So this work we've been doing on the Marshall Islands. I still have a year or a bit more we have all the data gathered, but we can go back still to the field, and even with the data we have already gathered, we can take so many angles that we can choose what portion do we want to really focus on in the presenting results. So the question now is knowing where the IPCC is and know where what kind of empirical information is really lacking. I know from from AR5, the fifth assessment report, that there was almost no empirical work on adaptation limits on the ground. People's adaptation limits, only like in a natural science there was a bit more. So what do you think for AR6 would be really a gap, that maybe this kind of data that we gathered on migration and the relation to climatic stresses, what aspects would you advise us to focus the results on?
Thank you. Any other questions? So I wanted to ask you all a little bit about coastal resilience in particular. So, you know, we have decided to focus on coastal resilience. You know, we can talk about food security and climate threats to food security. We can talk about urban resilience. What is the specificity of coastal resilience that allows us to think that there may be opportunities for us to take action? So let's talk a little bit about the specificity of coastal resilience and how that positions us to be able to take action. So that's one topic. The other one that I'd like to touch upon, and I'm a little surprised that it hasn't come out a little bit more prominently in our discussions that we have been having and the discussions that we've had in the Academy this week, and it's the question on health. The health dimensions of climate change impacts. We know that this can serve as a mobilizer for community action. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about how do you see those connections and what are the opportunities about that. So Case's question and what research can be meaningful in the context of the IPCC, what are the gaps, the specificity of coastal resilience, and then connections to health and well-being. So Chris, could we start with you?
Well, you know, the interest in providing experimental data on adaptation and adaptation outcomes, super important. I think that with all of our adaptation research, the real challenge is thinking about designing projects so that they can be monitored, so we can learn from experience, and so that that learning can be documented and generalized. And I think just in general, focusing on good design of adaptation projects, and especially understanding where the limits are, super important. You know, the question of why coastal resilience, I appreciate that we didn't speak to it directly, but I think we sort of surrounded the issue. And I'll just mention two aspects. I mean, the first is that most people live near the coast. The coasts are really fundamental, and I love the concept of the big ocean nations instead of the small island nations. And you know, it's the coasts are simply central to the human experience, and it's a problem and an opportunity we need to solve. I think the other aspect of coastal resilience that is really important and is unique about it is that discussions throughout the series of Uncommon Dialogues really have identified a wide range of opportunities for using investments in building resilience to build stronger communities, more robust economies, to really advance the human condition. And that definitely has to include health. I'll let Catherine and Alice speak more specifically to the question of human health. Simply mentioning that in this country, especially, getting rid of coal in the power sector could have a greater short-term effect on human health than almost any of the other things we could do.
Catherine?
Great. So your summary of where the adaptation assessment was in the last round was spot on. So this concept of adaptation limits was really new in the assessment, and it essentially is the point at which, for some people, somewhere, there are intolerable risks that will require a fundamental change, whether it's migration or just deciding that you're going to get up and move that industry to your next jurisdiction up farther to the north. To pick up some of the pieces that Chris is describing, I think a really interesting point that the authors like to phrase it as was saying that our challenges in pointing to what is effective adaptation, not just adaptation that is occurring, but what is effective, is at this point such a big challenge that it's one of the major limits to adaptation in the current world. And I think bridging that gap is a really key aspect of science moving forward. In terms of coastal risk specifically, I realize that we've been wandering all over the place. Indeed, people and infrastructure are positioned in the coastal area. That's both the challenge of coastal resilience. We're behind the 8 ball now, and nothing like Harvey and Irma and Maria to really emphasize that. But it also is something that is an advantage in some ways in that people love the coast. They love living there. They love the beauty of the water and the freshness of people and nature in harmony. And that's something that can be tapped productively. Health. So many different places we could go there. On the extreme side, there are many different ways that extreme events have adverse health outcomes, whether it's pathogens being carried in water, whether it's sewage rising into that water. There are very profound health impacts that tend to unfold in the aftermath of disaster, especially when flooding is involved. There are also the ways that disease vectors are shifting in a changing climate, and that shifts patterns of outcomes, both in terms of the vulnerability of different systems, but also diseases showing up in new places. And then on the climate change mitigation side, there's this statistic that we like to use quite a lot. There are about as many coal miners in the US as there are Americans who die from PM 2.5 coal pollution every year. That's something that you would think we could make our policy environment work such that this is a transition towards opportunity, away from an energy system that is not good for Americans, even though obviously we've been having some backward steps as of late.
So as to specificity of coastal resilience, when I first started thinking about this, we have megacities there, many megacities on our coasts. They are already adapting. The most certain, or one of the most certain impacts from climate change. So it just makes sense that we go where things are already occurring and where there is already a need. On the health dimensions, we mentioned the polling and the national security. We didn't mention, actually, the polling for using national security as a lever to get folks interested in climate is not so good. Many people do not like national security being associated with climate change. I don't fully understand the reasons for that. To the contrary, the polling on health and climate change, that is a lever that gets people interested in understanding what we can do to prevent negative health outcomes. One of the things that my work in the policy world focused on is that there's not a wide understanding of how dangerous extreme heat is. That's another impact we have a lot of good data that will have more extremes and extreme events. It's a huge killer for the United States. So on a policy level, we did, in the Obama administration, work on education of communities as to what they can do. And there are very concrete steps you can take to help their populations with extreme heat. The spread of vector-borne diseases is a challenge for us. Dengue, chikungunya, Zika, and to some extent Ebola. But the challenge for us is it's not widely understood in either the public health community or our medical schools, our nursing schools. And there is currently an initiative, the Global Consortium on Health and Climate Change, signing up schools across the United States with a commitment to improve their curriculum as to educating the future health workers so that they are more able to recognize that a disease is now appearing in their community that hasn't, and what steps need to be taken to keep the population healthy. It's an area that hasn't received enough attention, in my opinion, just in terms of making all of us aware of our greater risk. And we each have it, whatever location we move to, whether it's extreme heat event or a tick-borne disease here in the Mid-Atlantic area where the tick season is far longer, and you're much more likely to contract something. But it's the doctors who need us to be aware, or their assistants to help us recognize that that's occurred. A lot of work to be done there, a lot of people interested in doing the work. The problem is, in so much of this, it's fitting into an already pre-existing curriculum and very busy lives to say they need to take on this extra task. And that's pretty much true in each of these disciplines. There's a lot of great work already occurring, and now we're saying there's a new thing that you need to be up to speed on. So there is, surprisingly to me, some lack of interest from some schools in getting involved in educating the new health workers about this growing risk. That's surprising to me, but that is the reality of what we encountered.
Great, thank you. Your last chance at questions, and it's Friday afternoon. All right, I have 4 final very quick questions, but let's go to my colleague, Megan Parker.
I thank you, Regimark, and thank you all for the panels and for all of the work on this great initiative. So I want to pick up a little bit on the question Roger Mark asked about security and Alice's remark that climate security hasn't polled well. One of the things that we've noticed in the work that Roger Mark mentioned with USAID is that a lot of the research and a lot of the focus has been on how climate leads to conflict or impacts conflict. But we've also looked at it from the other direction. How can doing conflict prevention actually increase people's ability to deal with the kinds of challenges that they may face, like climate change? Now, of course, there's a lot less research on that. We featured a little bit of it here. But I also wonder, to what degree do you think that might be a new way to reach people? It's sort of harder, and it's sort of understood to be harder to sell peace than war. Is there a way that we can use the resilience concept to focus more on how helping communities deal with these multiple challenges can help them in these multiple ways, both climate and conflict?
Great, thank you. I think that's a great question. So as we take into account that question, let me add just a few more, and we'll wrap up with this last set of questions. You know, I was intrigued with our conversation earlier today when one of our colleagues mentioned that he operates in the climate space. And in operating in the climate space, he never uses the term resilience, that has no currency in that space. It's adaptation, it's mitigation, it's loss and damage. And I wonder, are there situations where you choose to use resilience, and are there others when you don't? You know, I have heard communities have told me, stop telling me I'm resilient. You know, we have also heard from others who have said, well, when I hear resilience, I hear you're on your own. Okay, so there are different dimensions. So just the terminology. Are there times you deliberately use it, and are there times you say, no, it's not going to fly? We have mentioned the private sector. And earlier we talked about the insurance and reinsurance industry. Are there any additional dimensions or ways that we should be more purposefully engaging the private sector? We've made reference to making the business case. Is there anything else that we want to say around that? My third question, and Catherine, you know, I liked in your comments, you ended by saying we want to have this sense of hope, not fear. We all work with young people. We have young researchers, folks in the university setting who are coming to us who are saying, I want to work in this area, but I want to have a sense that I can make a difference. So if you imagine that you have a young person who is looking forward to his or her career in this space, what advice do you give them now? What would you say to a young person coming to you saying, I want to make a contribution in this climate resilience space? What can I do? And then finally, what opportunities do you see for us on the horizon moving forward? Where should we go next with this collaboration? What's next for us? So a very good question from Megan. Is it easier to sell war than peace? Do we need to change our framing? Does that help us deal with climate impacts if we come in from a peace-building perspective? Do you always use resilience or not? When and why not? Is there a better role for the private sector? How would you advise a young person, and where should we go next? So you could do 1, 2, 3. I know there are lots of questions there, but let's sort of end with that round. So Alice, can we go back to you?
Sure. Let me start with the private sector. The private sector, very important player in that obviously drives much of our economy. One thing that I have been becoming more attuned to is that the private sector needs to be more explicit about its consideration of climate risk. As a former judge, I anticipate we'll see growing litigation in this area. One area that will become an area that's easier to pursue in our courts than trying to pin liability on a oil company on the basis of their emissions will be professional liability, in that at some point it's a reasonably foreseeable that you will be damaged if the building doesn't withstand the impacts, if you're certifying financials that don't accurately reflect the risks to the company. As these things become more manifest, at some point there is a professional duty, and that is a much easier legal hurdle to meet. It's also, it's not criminal, it's by a preponderance of the evidence, and for those of you who've been in law school, you might have heard this analogy, that's in the scale. There's a feather on one side. That's how what preponderance is, just a little, anything above 50% to prove liability. So this will start emerging in the courts. It's not a particularly efficient system to get to action, but it will cause greater concern as there are verdicts that demonstrate a failure to honor their duty of care. On the young persons, if it's a person who's looking for a job, from my observations, the action currently is in the states, in the United States, or in cities. It's not in the federal government. That is not going to be a place you can go. I do refer to this climate change, unfortunately, as the Full Employment Act. If a young person is interested in this field and develops an expertise in virtually anything, health, water, buildings, coastal green infrastructure, you will quickly find yourself in demand. I use myself as an example. I am a relative newcomer. If I were trying to become a Russian expert or something, that would be a virtual impossibility because the career path is so long for these non-emerging risks. But here, for anyone interested and you develop a sufficient expertise, there is a thirst for knowledge and people who have had some experience. So I sell it all the time. I think it's a terrific career, other than it's distressing the great risk we're running, and you have to figure out a way to ensure that you retain your optimism. So the final thing on selling resilience or peace building, what the federal government has turned towards, we do use the words resilience, but also all hazards. That it's not just climate. So move away from the climate, it's all hazards. It's whether it's an earthquake, it could be natural hazards, it can be a terrorist attack. But really, if you're building resilience, you want to be resilient to everything, not just climate. Climate, you have to consider that it's something you haven't seen historically in the past and plan to that. But otherwise, it is amongst a panoply of risks that every community is facing all the time. And it's better to be prepared for all hazards. That will make it much more likely that you remain resilient.
Great. Another amazing series of questions. So going back to the first one on the complex interactions between conflict and how saying what's the role of climate change for conflict is missing half of the picture. First of all, I think there's a really important way that conflict creates phenomenal vulnerability to climate change impacts. So as part of this project, we've been doing interviews with diverse stakeholders in the adaptation space and in the conflict risk reduction space. And nothing like talking to a climate change adaptation group that's saying, well, when we can't get out and do projects because conflict is ongoing and either we're going to exacerbate it or put our workers at risk, you're not able to adapt in that kind of circumstance. And the flip side of that is that enabling peace is about creating adaptive capacity in so many different circumstances. On the second question of vocabulary, we've got resilience, adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage, sustainable development, preparedness, safeguarding, all kind of saying the same thing from different angles. And I think a really key point is what Alice emphasized, where in many cases you have to ask and you have to poll and you need to be sensitive to the fact that climate responses will resonate really differently for different people for different reasons, and oftentimes you can have the exact same action make sense from a lot of different perspectives, and you don't want vocabulary to be the thing that's getting in the way. On the third question of how to achieve leadership in the private sector, there's so many ways that business in the present world, when it's climate resilient, will actually be a lot more profitable in terms of supply chains or assets at risk. That's kind of very obvious entry points for win-win adaptation opportunities. At the same time that I think there's a big role for the private sector to create new forms of adaptation. Can we get that price signal there such that risk is in the markets? Can we get the private sector pushing on the public sector to create new flexibility in contracts and land use, for example? The final point was, well, I guess the final point was what we should do next. I'll leave that one to Chris. The final point.
Yeah, I kind of pitched that one too.
So the final point that I'll answer to is how do we tap hope and the power of young people? I often think that the most important thing I do, and by far the most compelling thing I do, is work with young, passionate, brilliant people who are way smarter than me in so many different ways, and you just kind of feel like one by one you're popping off these environmental leaders for the future. I think starting with hope is really important. Climate change is a really powerful way to build a better world. And the key thing about adaptation and resilience is that it requires all possible entry points in terms of jobs and careers in the future, but also in terms of disciplines that people are training through. And I think that's a really powerful thing to tap.
Well, thanks, everybody. Thank Alice and Catherine and Roger Mark especially. Really great conversation. And I guess if I've learned one thing from my work in climate change and from this series, it's that there's not really a single frame that works all the time. And I'm perfectly comfortable with the frame of exploring whether climate change causes conflict, but I also am perfectly comfortable with the idea of the frame that by decreasing the risk of conflict, we can increase our ability to deal effectively with climate change. Similarly with the vocabulary concerning adaptation, building resilience, growing economies, I think that what we need is the understanding that lets us pursue the big picture in a compelling way. And I think that all those fit into a narrative that really is most effective if it moves forward under the banner of hope rather than despair. And I think the other strong conclusion I've gotten from all of our sessions here is that there are a wide range of compelling things we can do that address the climate challenge. At the same time, they address challenges of sustainability in local communities, of building better ecosystems, and that sense of hope and optimism can really be animating, and it can also deal with the frustrations of being in a field where you don't get big victories every day. You know, the risks are real, and we don't want to shy away from being honest and clear about the risks, but I think the potential for action is really going to come from animating those risks with a sense of where we can move towards solutions. This conversation between the communities that are kind of gathered by the Wilson Center and Hoover and Stanford is really interesting, and I think it's one of the sets of interactions that we haven't capitalized on very fully. I love the way that the Wilson Center pulls together a bottom-up community-based perspective, an international perspective, recognizes the importance of indigenous people and the sense that a dialogue is going to be the key way to advance. I think from the university perspective, we definitely bring an emerging sense of the risks, of the communication challenges, of the nature of the kinds of solutions, and we also bring an increasing appreciation of the importance of thinking about broad-based partnerships. And I think that the really valuable thing that the Hoover Institution brings is the ability to connect, especially in the United States, with a wide range of stakeholders who are they're suspicious of Roger Mark and they're suspicious of Catherine and me. So I think that what I would love to see us do in the future is capitalize on our ability to think very broadly about the set of conversations and very broadly about managing that in a way that lets us spin off a number of individual products, recognizing that this is going to be a long process with a need for lots and lots of contributions to a solution rather than some grand synthesis.
Wow. That's a lot for a Friday afternoon, the end of of a busy week. But you know, as we try to figure out these pieces and how we could begin to manage a conversation on it, we started thinking about infrastructure, we started thinking about sea level rise, we started thinking about ocean health. It led us thinking about slow moving events, rapid onset events. You know, it led to a discussion about what we knew, what the unknowns were, what are the questions to pose, what it meant for looking at thresholds, what it meant for looking at nonlinearities, what it meant for looking at flips. You know, what do we know? How are we doing? How are we performing? How do we begin to look at these different components? From there, it took us to look at these issues on the East Coast, on the West Coast, to look at it internationally, to look at it at different scales. You know, how do we look at it at the level of a state, at different regions, at a very localized level, at the community level, and then hearing from, seeing some of this also reflected in our conversations with our international counterparts. That led to discussions about mitigation, about adaptation, about loss and damage, about resilience, about sustainable development, about poverty alleviation. All of these things were very much part of our discussion. And I think ultimately led us to a point where we had very rich engagement about this question of risk. How do we begin to identify the risks? How can we better identify these risks? What does that mean for how we communicate these risks? Are we able to effectively convey what we know and what we don't know about those risks? And what are the response mechanisms that we see? How are different communities responding? How are people responding at an individual level? And I appreciated Chris's point about there's also the risk inherent in being a first mover. So, you know, just sort of the response mechanisms and risks, I thought was a very important component. The second key takeaway for me was the multifaceted ways that we need to respond to these issues. So we spoke about infrastructure, social dimensions, technology. We spoke about working across sectors, different partners, government, NGO, private sector, ecosystems. We did also have a very much the strong focus on nature-based solutions. We also talked about moving across disciplines, deconstructing our learning, unlearning some of the ways that we operate. And we also talked about this in a sense of, I think, looking at how we engage young people. I really like what Alice said about, you know, working on this set of issues is an all-opportunity employment approach. There's so many dimensions to this. So the multifaceted dimension and opportunities, I think, was a key point for us. Then finally, it came back once again to this point that we heard from Salim, this question of solidarity. We're all in this together. How do we ultimately move our hearts and minds? And that led to some of our thinking around co-benefits and how we articulate that. So, wow, that's really, really fruitful engagement. And I think we feel a certain responsibility to think about where we take this next. So we would invite you to continue to engage with us at a minimal level. This has been webcast live. This will be video archived. We will write up a summary of these discussions that we've had with you this afternoon that will be on our new Security Beat blog platform. We, as a collaboration with Hoover and Stanford University and the Wilson Center, will produce some short digestible outcomes, which we will be sharing with you. And then we will also be thinking about where we go next. One of the things that we had been thinking of, and this came through our conversations with our international partners, is this sort of rapid onset event, something that really is catastrophic. We really haven't focused on that dimension too much, so we were thinking maybe that's one area that we may be looking at next. But stay tuned. This is an important opportunity, a wonderful collaboration, and we think there's real value added here. And part of that value added is having you engaged, participating on a Friday afternoon. So thank you again. Please join me in thanking my colleagues for a really good partnership.